Hello everyone, this is Jake. Today I'm going to share with you a story told to me by a close friend, Audrey. It's a story of deception, betrayal, and a woman's struggle under the crushing weight of family promises. This is a story that made me question where we draw the line between love, duty, and self-destruction. It's a raw account of how Audrey discovered that her greatest sacrifice was built on an elaborate lie. This is the suitcase deception. My hands were trembling uncontrollably as I stood in front of my parents' old house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, staring at my phone screen. A money transfer was about to be confirmed, a payment that would completely change my life. My name is Audrey. I am 32 years old, and I was about to send away the very last of my savings to save a life. The amount was $3,000. Money I had painfully scraped together by selling my only car because my mother said the hospital bills had doubled overnight. As my finger hovered over the confirmation button, a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. This payment meant I wouldn't be able to pay my own rent this month. But I felt like I had no other choice. At that moment, a frantic voice called out from behind me, freezing me in place. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Miller, was hurrying toward me, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a determination and expression I had never seen in all the years I had known her. She grabbed my hand before I could complete the transfer and whispered urgently, "Stop sending money. Check the suitcase." Immediately, before I reveal the shocking secret that was waiting for me inside the house, you have to understand the weight of a promise I made when I was 16. The origin of that burden traces back to a relentless rainy afternoon in Fort Wayne when my father was killed in a tragic accident at the local steel mill. He left behind a crushing amount of debt and 3 women who had no idea how to survive without his guidance. I stood in front of his sealed mahogany casket while rain pounded against the windows of the funeral home, and I silently vowed that I would step into his place, carry his responsibilities, and protect the family he left behind, no matter what it cost my own future happiness. That tragedy reshaped my mother into someone I barely recognized. She poured all her grief and fear into an obsessive need to protect my younger sister, Whitney, whom she decided was far too fragile to face a cruel world. She convinced herself that Whitney needed to be shielded from every hardship, while I was expected to become unbreakable steel, holding up a roof that was already starting to collapse. Whitney grew up believing that the world owed her comfort simply for existing, because our mother never required her to lift a finger or face consequences for her laziness, while I worked double shifts at a diner after school. Eventually, I crushed the acceptance letter from a nearby university in my hands, knowing that my modest diner wages would never be enough to cover the mortgage or satisfy their endless demands for new clothes and the latest gadgets. I moved 3 hours away to Chicago where the pay was higher and worked my way up from washing dishes to managing a chaotic logistics office through determination and countless sleepless nights. I lived in basement apartments with leaking pipes and skipped meals regularly just to make sure I could send 70% of my paycheck back home to preserve the comfortable middle-class lifestyle they refused to give up. That warped dynamic became a permanent trap exactly 2 years ago when Whitney called me in tears to say she had been diagnosed with a rare and rapidly progressing autoimmune disease that local doctors could not explain. She described symptoms that were frighteningly vague: constant exhaustion and deep bone pain, which required expensive experimental treatments that our insurance conveniently did not cover. My mother forbade me from visiting during those early months, claiming that Whitney was losing her hair and felt too ashamed to let her successful older sister see her in such a weak and pitiful condition. I never questioned them, because the paralyzing fear of losing the only family I had left pushed me into extreme financial sacrifices that no rational person would accept. I sold the only reliable car I owned and replaced it with a rusted junker just so I could send the remaining money to cover what they said was the first round of specialized injections costing thousands of dollars. My life turned into an exhausting blur as I took on 2 additional night jobs cleaning corporate offices just to wire them a fixed amount of $1,500 every single month without delay. That massive sum was never enough. My mother called constantly with new emergencies. Broken appliances, sudden medical complications, all of them demanding immediate cash before doctors would supposedly continue treatment. She sobbed into the phone, telling me Whitney was crying in agony because they could not afford the new pain management therapy recommended by her private specialist. I drowned in debt and exhaustion while believing I was a noble hero keeping my sister alive through my own suffering. And I never once stopped to ask for a receipt. The emotional manipulation was so precise that I felt guilty for buying myself a cup of coffee, while my sister was supposedly fighting for her life in a dark room somewhere in Indiana. That cycle of guilt and payment continued relentlessly until I had nothing left to give except the very last check in my hand. I sold the only reliable car I owned and replaced it with a rusted junker just so I could send the remaining money to cover what they said was the first round of specialized injections costing thousands of dollars. My life turned into an exhausting blur as I took on 2 additional night jobs cleaning corporate offices just to wire them a fixed amount of $1,500 every single month without delay. That massive sum was never enough. My mother called constantly with new emergencies. Broken appliances, sudden medical complications, all of them demanding immediate cash before doctors would supposedly continue treatment. She sobbed into the phone, telling me Whitney was crying in agony because they could not afford the new pain management therapy recommended by her private specialist. I drowned in debt and exhaustion while believing I was a noble hero keeping my sister alive through my own suffering. And I never once stopped to ask for a receipt. The emotional manipulation was so precise that I felt guilty for buying myself a cup of coffee, while my sister was supposedly fighting for her life in a dark room somewhere in Indiana. That cycle of guilt and payment continued relentlessly until I had nothing left to give except the very last check in my hand. 3 months ago, an unexpected business trip for my company accidentally took me through my hometown without any prior notice. I found myself driving down the interstate just 10 miles from the exit to Fort Wayne when I impulsively decided to take a detour because I wanted to surprise my family with a brief visit. My intention was purely to provide some emotional comfort to Whitney during what my mother had described as a particularly difficult week of chemotherapy treatments and debilitating pain. I pulled my rental car into the driveway expecting to see signs of a medical crisis or perhaps my mother rushing around with medications. But the house sat in complete silence. The driveway was empty, and every single window was tightly covered by heavy curtains, which seemed completely contrary to the way my mother usually kept the house aired out during sickness. I walked up the concrete path toward the front porch only to discover that the heavy oak door was locked tight, and the house felt abandoned rather than occupied by a sick patient. I immediately pulled out my phone to call my mother because a sudden wave of panic washed over me that perhaps Whitney had been rushed to the emergency room while I was driving. The phone rang multiple times before she finally answered with a breathless and chaotic tone that sounded suspiciously exaggerated against the background silence on her end. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked where they were because I was standing on the front porch with a bag of groceries and good intentions. "Mom, I am standing right outside the front door, but nobody is answering and the car is gone," I said into the receiver. My mother gasped audibly before launching into a rapid explanation that sounded rehearsed. "Oh, honey, you should have called first because we are at the hospital right now. Your sister is having a terrible reaction to the new medication and is in absolute agony, so we cannot leave her side for even a minute." I felt a pit form in my stomach as I asked which hospital ward they were in so I could drive over to sit with them. "No," she shouted a little too quickly before lowering her voice to a dramatic whisper. "She is too ashamed for you to see her vomiting like this, Audrey. Please do not come here and do not go into the house because it is a disaster zone of medical supplies and germs." She hung up before I could argue, but the silence of the neighborhood was broken by a voice from the adjacent yard. My longtime neighbor, Mrs. Miller, was standing by the fence holding a garden hose and shaking her head with a look of pure disgust directed at my mother's house. She beckoned me closer with a wave of her hand, and I walked over to the property line, feeling confused by the conflicting information I was receiving. "Mrs. Miller, do you know when they left for the hospital?" I asked, hoping for some clarity. Mrs. Miller let out a sharp laugh that sounded devoid of any humor. "Hospital? Is that what she told you? I watched them pile into a taxi at 6 o'clock this morning, looking like they were ready for a spring break party." I stared at her in disbelief because my brain could not reconcile the image of my dying sister with a vacation. "But Mom said Whitney is in critical condition and they rushed her to the emergency room." Mrs. Miller turned off the hose and leaned over the fence to look me straight in the eye. "What emergency? She just hauled a giant surfboard out here and tossed it into the trunk." You are too naive, Audrey. So go inside and look at that empty house for yourself. Her words hit me like a physical blow, and I walked back to the front door with trembling hands to retrieve the spare key I kept hidden under a loose brick in the planter. The lock clicked open and I stepped into the foyer expecting the smell of sickness or antiseptic. But instead, the house smelled stale and completely normal. I checked the bedrooms downstairs but found nothing out of place. So I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic where we stored old holiday decorations and keepsakes. The attic was dusty and dim, but a splash of bright color in the corner caught my eye immediately. It was Whitney's red suitcase, the large one she usually used for college trips, thrown carelessly onto a pile of old blankets, as if someone had been sorting through it recently. I knelt beside the suitcase and unzipped the main compartment, expecting to find winter clothes or perhaps old photo albums she was preserving. What I found instead made the breath catch in my throat because the suitcase was filled with a chaotic mess of paperwork and office supplies. I picked up a stack of papers and realized with horror that I was looking at a makeshift forgery workshop right there in our attic. There were hospital letterheads that had been clearly cut and pasted from the internet alongside practice sheets where someone had been trying to replicate a doctor's signature over and over again. I found invoices for chemotherapy drugs that were actually just edited templates with the prices inflated by thousands of dollars using a different font. My hands shook violently as I dug deeper and found a notebook detailing their expenses, which listed resort fees and designer clothing stores instead of medical bills. The realization that my sister's cancer was nothing more than an art project constructed with scissors and glue made me feel like I was going to be sick right there on the dusty floor. I wanted to scream and tear the house apart, but a cold, rational voice in my head told me to stop. If I confronted them now over the phone while they were sipping cocktails on a beach, they would deny everything and return home to destroy this evidence before I could prove anything legal. I carefully placed the fraudulent documents back into the suitcase exactly how I found them and zipped it shut to hide my intrusion. I walked out of that house with a taste of bile in my throat and locked the door behind me, knowing that the next time I returned I would bring a lawyer instead of groceries. The next morning, when the cold winter sunlight filtered into my impersonal hotel room, I began my private investigation with a mind that had turned dangerously cold. I sat at the small wooden desk and spread out the digital photographs I had secretly taken of the fraudulent documents inside the suitcase to cross-reference every single detail. My hands were steady as I dialed the contact number printed on the oncology department letterhead because I needed absolute confirmation before I could destroy my own family. I navigated through a series of automated menus until I finally reached a human administrative assistant who sounded exhausted but willing to help verify their current patient records. I provided my sister's full legal name and her date of birth while holding my breath and praying that perhaps I was just a paranoid sister who had misunderstood the situation. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for what felt like an eternity before the receptionist returned with a confused tone in her voice. "Ma'am, I have checked our current inpatient list and our archived records for the past 3 years, but we have absolutely no patient by that name." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pressed harder by asking to speak with the specialist listed on the paperwork I found. The receptionist hesitated before delivering the final blow to my hope. "Ma'am, we do not have any physician named Dr. Wilson in the oncology department, so you should double-check your information because you might be the victim of a scam." The confirmation that the doctor did not exist solidified my resolve. So, I immediately searched for the contact information of Whitney's ex-boyfriend, Rick, who she had dated right before her alleged diagnosis. I arranged to meet him at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, where I hoped we would not run into anyone who knew my family or their twisted secrets. Rick arrived looking skeptical and guarded in his mechanic's uniform, but he agreed to speak with me after I promised to buy him lunch and explain why I was asking questions. I hesitated before asking him why they had really separated because my mother had claimed he left because he was too weak to handle the tragedy of her illness. Rick let out a sharp and bitter laugh that drew the attention of the other patrons in the cafe before shaking his head in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? Is that what she told you? I left because she refused to get a job and expected me to pay for her champagne lifestyle on a mechanic's wage." He pulled out his cracked smartphone and navigated to a social media profile that I had never seen before because my own account had clearly been blocked from viewing it. He slid the phone across the table so I could see the stream of recent updates that painted a very different picture of my dying sister. Rick pointed at the screen with a grease-stained finger and spoke with palpable disgust. She is supposedly sick? Last week she was dancing on a table at a club downtown and bragging about the new designer handbag she bought with your charity money. I looked down at the bright screen to see a video of my sister looking vibrant and healthy while holding a bottle of expensive vodka in a VIP booth. The caption underneath thanked her generous sponsors for making her dreams come true, which made me feel physically ill to my stomach. The most devastating realization came when I swiped to the next photo and saw my mother in the background of a beach selfie, smiling and holding a matching cocktail. I finally understood that my mother was not a helpless victim being manipulated by a sick daughter, but rather the director of this entire cruel production. That evening, as I sat alone in the silence of my empty apartment, I stared at the phone on the coffee table and realized I had finally reached the breaking point where I had to make the fateful call to set my final trap. I took several deep and steadying breaths to force my racing heart into a calm rhythm, because I needed to execute this performance perfectly if I wanted to catch them in their own web of lies. My hands felt cold as I dialed my mother's familiar number and prepared myself to play the role of the dutiful and naive daughter one last time before I shattered that image forever. My mother answered on the third ring with a voice so heavy with performative sorrow that I almost hesitated before launching into the script I had rehearsed in the mirror for the last hour. I forced a tone of hysterical joy into my voice as I shouted into the receiver about a miraculous turn of events that had supposedly just happened at my company headquarters. Mom, you are not going to believe the incredible news I have, because I just got promoted to regional director, and the company gave me a signing bonus of $50,000 in cash. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a fraction of a second before the atmosphere shifted completely. My mother dropped her act of the weary caretaker instantly as her voice transformed from a pitiful whine into a tone of sugary sweetness that made my skin crawl. She did not even pause to congratulate me on my hard work before she immediately pivoted to how this money could serve her own selfish purposes. Oh, thank God. This money is truly a divine miracle because the specialist just told us this morning that Whitney needs emergency surgery that costs exactly that amount, or she might not make it through the month. I bit my lip to keep from screaming at the audacity of her lie because I knew for a fact that no doctor existed and my sister was perfectly healthy. I kept my voice steady as I told her that I wanted to use the money to save Whitney, but I insisted that I could not trust a bank transfer with such a large sum. I told her firmly that I would drive home this coming weekend to hand over the cash personally because I needed to see Whitney before she went into the hospital for this alleged procedure. My mother tried to argue that a wire transfer would be faster, but I heard a scuffle on the other end of the line as the phone was snatched away violently. Whitney screamed into the receiver with a voice that sounded nothing like a dying woman and everything like a greedy child who had just been offered a mountain of candy. Audrey, you listen to me. You make sure you bring every single cent of that $50,000 in cash because I am in too much pain to wait for banks to process a transfer. Her aggressive demand for cash confirmed everything I suspected about their desperation and their complete lack of conscience regarding my financial well-being. I promised her that I would be there on Saturday with the briefcase and hung up the phone before I lost my composure and told them exactly what I thought of their soulless behavior. I disconnected the call with a trembling finger and immediately dialed a different number to speak with my personal attorney who was waiting for my signal. I instructed him to finalize the criminal complaint for wire fraud and theft by deception because I now had their verbal confirmation that they were soliciting funds for a fictitious medical procedure. I sat back on my sofa and stared at the dark ceiling while feeling a cold resolve settle over me because I knew the next time I saw my family would be the last time they ever saw me as their victim. That weekend, I drove a rented black sedan to my childhood home in Fort Wayne, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that held total destruction rather than the financial salvation they were greedily expecting. I parked the vehicle directly in the driveway behind my mother's car and took a moment to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white because I needed to steel myself for the performance of a lifetime. I walked up the concrete path with the briefcase clutched tightly in my right hand and pushed open the front door without knocking because I wanted to catch them in the middle of their final rehearsal. The scene that awaited me inside the living room was so elaborately staged that, for a split second, I almost admired their dedication to the narrative of tragedy they had woven for 2 years. My mother had pushed the furniture against the walls to make space for a rented hospital bed, where Whitney lay shivering under a thin blanket with her head wrapped in a thick scarf to simulate hair loss. My mother rushed forward to greet me with her hands clasped together in a gesture of desperate prayer, while large artificial tears streamed down her cheeks to perfect the image of a grieving parent. She pulled me into a suffocating embrace that felt incredibly cold and calculated, because I could feel her eyes darting over my shoulder to stare hungrily at the leather briefcase I was holding. She pulled back to look at me with a trembling chin and whispered that I had arrived just in time because Whitney was fading fast and the ambulance service was only waiting for the cash deposit to come pick her up. I looked past her shoulder to see Whitney let out a theatrical moan of pain that sounded more like a bored teenager than a dying patient. As she shifted comfortably on the expensive medical mattress, I walked past my mother without saying a word and placed the briefcase deliberately on the coffee table before sinking into the armchair that used to belong to my father. I crossed my legs calmly and stared at them with an unreadable expression because I wanted to see how far they would go to secure the money before I pulled the rug out from under them. Before I hand over this entire life savings, I need to verify some specific details about the post-operative care plan that Dr. Wilson has outlined for her recovery, I said with a voice that was dangerously steady. My mother froze for a moment before exchanging a nervous glance with Whitney, who had stopped moaning to listen intently to the conversation about her imaginary treatment. I pressed them further by asking about the specific dosage of the anesthesia and the name of the anesthesiologist who would be performing the procedure at the hospital that evening. My mother began to stammer incoherently as she tried to invent medical terminology on the spot while Whitney pulled the blanket up higher to hide the fact that she was perfectly healthy. "Well," my mother said, "it is a very complex mixture of drugs that I cannot pronounce, but we trust him completely," while wiping sweat from her forehead. I leaned forward with a shark-like smile and asked them why the hospital records I checked yesterday showed no scheduled surgeries for anyone with our last name. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from mournful to hostile as they realized that I was not behaving like the obedient bank machine they were used to manipulating. My mother's face turned a violent shade of red as she dropped the act of the sorrowful caretaker and let her true aggressive nature surface. She stomped her foot on the floor and screamed at me with venom in her voice. "Why are you asking so many useless technical questions when your sister is lying there in agony waiting for the ambulance to save her life? Give me the money right now so we can go." Whitney sat up in the bed and forgot to act weak as she pointed a finger at the briefcase and demanded that I stop wasting time because she was tired of waiting. I stood up slowly and placed my hand on the latches of the briefcase while watching their eyes light up with pure, unadulterated greed. I clicked the locks open with a loud snap that echoed in the silent room and reached inside to grab the thick stack of papers I had prepared. Instead of the neat bundles of $100 bills they were salivating over, I pulled out a handful of glossy photographs and legal documents. I threw the photographs into the air with a violent motion, causing them to rain down on the hospital bed and cover Whitney in images of her own deceit. The photos showed Whitney dancing on tables at nightclubs and sunbathing at luxury resorts, while holding expensive cocktails during the exact weeks she claimed to be in chemotherapy. My mother snatched one of the photos from the air and stared at it with horror as the color drained from her face because she realized the game was completely over. I looked them both in the eye and delivered the final verdict with a voice that shook the walls of the house my father built. "There is no $50,000 anywhere in this room because the only thing I brought you is a federal court summons and irrefutable proof of your fraud. The play is over." When the damning evidence fluttered down like confetti around the rented hospital bed, the atmosphere in the living room shattered into absolute chaos. The carefully constructed illusion of the past 2 years evaporated in an instant, replaced by the raw, ugly truth laid bare on the floor. Whitney's reaction was purely instinctual terror. She completely forgot her role as the terminally ill patient. With a sharp gasp, she leaped off the mattress with the agility of a healthy athlete, the thin blanket tangling around her legs. She ripped the heavy wool scarf from her head in a frantic, panicked motion, revealing a thick, lustrous, and obviously freshly highlighted mane of chestnut hair. The sight was grotesque, her perfectly styled hair, her makeup still intact from the morning, contrasting violently with the grim medical setting they had staged. She stood there, breathing heavily, a picture of vibrant health surrounded by the proof of her elaborate deceit. What is this? What are these? She shrieked, scrambling on her hands and knees to gather the glossy photographs. She snatched one showing her in a sequin dress, laughing with a cocktail in hand at a beachfront bar in Miami. Dated just 3 weeks prior, during a week she had claimed to be undergoing a particularly grueling round of chemotherapy. Her voice cracked. These are fake. You photoshopped these. I didn't move from my father's armchair. I simply watched, my earlier nerves now replaced by a glacial calm. The metadata doesn't lie, Whitney, and neither does the flight manifest I obtained from a resourceful contact. Miami International, February 14th. A lovely Valentine's Day getaway, paid for by my rent money, I assume. My mother, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, was still staring at the photograph in her hand. A picture of herself grinning broadly, wearing a new designer sun hat, arm in arm with Whitney in front of a luxury resort sign. The performative tears had stopped, leaving tracks in her heavy foundation. My mother, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, was still staring at the photograph in her hand. A picture of herself grinning broadly, wearing a new designer sun hat, arm in arm with Whitney in front of a luxury resort sign. The performative tears had stopped, leaving tracks in her heavy foundation. Her face had morphed from theatrical grief into a mask of stunned, dawning horror. Not horror at what they had done to me, but horror at being caught. You investigated us? She whispered, the words barely audible. You left a suitcase full of evidence in the attic, Mother? I said, my voice flat. Forged letterheads, practice signatures, fake invoices. It wasn't exactly a masterclass in criminal secrecy. It was sloppy, greedy, and pathetic. That word, pathetic, seemed to jolt Whitney out of her panic and into rage. She threw the photos she'd collected back onto the floor and advanced on me, her finger jabbing the air. You have no right. You owe us. After everything we've been through, after Dad died, you were supposed to take care of us. This is just your way of trying to get out of your responsibility. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her statement almost made me laugh. My responsibility? My responsibility was to help my family, not fund a decade-long vacation for two con artists. I sold my car, Whitney. I lived in a basement with mold. I skipped meals. For 2 years, I believed you were dying. And you were what? Picking out new swimsuits. My mother finally found her voice, but it wasn't the sugary, manipulative tone or the screeching anger from moments before. It was a cold, hard, bargaining voice. She dropped the photograph and straightened her posture, trying to reclaim some semblance of dignity. Audrey, this has gone far enough. You've made your point. You're hurt. We may have exaggerated the situation for your support. Exaggerated. I exploded, finally rising from the chair. You invented a fatal disease. You fabricated medical documents. You emotionally tortured me for money. That's not an exaggeration, Mother. That's fraud. That's theft by deception. And thanks to the interstate wire transfers, it's a federal crime. The legal terminology hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. I saw the true fear enter my mother's eyes for the first time. Not fear of losing me, but fear of the concrete consequences I was describing. You wouldn't, Whitney spat, though her bravado was fading. You wouldn't send your own mother and sister to jail. You're right, I said calmly, watching hope flicker in their eyes for a split second before I extinguished it. I won't have to. The evidence will. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, has already filed a formal criminal complaint with the county prosecutor and the federal bureau. The evidence packet is quite comprehensive. Digital copies of the forged documents, bank records tracing my payments to your accounts and subsequent transfers to travel agencies and boutiques, sworn statements from my neighbor Mrs. Miller about your hospital trips, and even a deposition from Rick about your robust health. I walked slowly to the briefcase and pulled out the final item. A thick, official-looking document with a court seal. This is a civil suit. It seeks restitution for every single dollar I sent you over the last 2 years, plus punitive damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress. And it includes a lien on this house. The house? My mother shrieked, her composure breaking entirely. You can't take the house. This is my home. Your father's home. It was his home, I corrected her, my voice trembling slightly for the first time. He worked himself to death in that steel mill to pay for it, and you used it as a stage to manipulate his other daughter out of her future. The mortgage is in arrears because you were too busy buying handbags. I walked the cliffs of Santorini and felt the sun on my skin, a sensation of freedom so profound it brought tears to my eyes. I was no longer a pack mule carrying someone else's load. I was just Audrey, a woman rediscovering the world and herself. I kept in gentle contact with Mrs. Miller. She became a kind of anchor to that part of my history. I sent her a lavish gift basket from Harrods when I was in London, with a note that simply read, "Thank you for seeing me when I was blind." She writes me monthly letters now, filled with benign neighborhood gossip, who painted their house, whose grandchild is visiting, and never mentions my mother or sister unless I ask. She understands I have closed that book. Through her, I learned of their new reality. My mother and Whitney, unable to afford anything in their old neighborhood, moved into a cramped, run-down efficiency apartment in a bleak part of town. The conditions were a brutal shock to their systems. My mother, as per her probation requirements, got a job as a cashier at a discount grocery store. The humiliation of being recognized by former acquaintances was, according to Mrs. Miller, a punishment in itself. She comes home to a cold apartment with the sounds of arguing neighbors through thin walls. Whitney's probation officer secured her a job as a dishwasher at a busy, greasy diner on the highway. Mrs. Miller reported seeing her once, waiting for a bus in a cheap coat, her hands red and raw from the scalding water and chemicals. The irony was not lost on me. She was finally doing the honest, grueling work she had always looked down on me for doing. The fairy tale of a life funded by my suffering was over. She now lives the reality of the value of $1 earned, not scammed. I have blocked every phone number, email, and social media account connected to them. They tried to contact me a few times in the early days, my mother with weepy, "How could you?" messages, Whitney with angry, entitled demands to. The criminal case was settled with a plea bargain. To avoid a trial and the possibility of a longer federal prison sentence, they both pleaded guilty to charges of wire fraud and theft by deception. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had reviewed the evidence with clear disgust, sentenced them to 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service each, and mandated full financial restitution to me as a condition of that probation. A felony conviction would remain on their records. The civil suit proceeded in parallel. With the criminal guilt established, the judgment was swift. The court awarded me a sum representing every cent I had wired to them over the 2-year period of the scam, plus a significant amount in punitive damages. The lien on the house was enforced. The bank foreclosed on the Fort Wayne house. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle they had refused to give up was sold at auction to a young family. I attended the auction, sitting in the back. I felt a pang as the gavel fell. Not for the loss of the house, but for the memory of my father who had loved it, and for the naive girl I had been when I lived there. That girl was gone. The proceeds from the sale, after the bank was paid, were directed to me as part of the restitution. It wasn't a life-changing fortune, but it was my life, returned to me. I used a portion of the money to do something I had never dreamed possible. I put a down payment on a bright, clean, 1-bedroom apartment in a nice neighborhood of Chicago. It had large windows, no leaking pipes, and was mine alone. The first night I slept there, the silence was not lonely. It was peaceful. The largest chunk of the restitution, however, I used to book a trip. A 6-week tour of Europe. Italy, Greece, France, Spain. It was the dream I had crumpled up with that university acceptance letter all those years ago. I didn't go to escape. I went to reclaim. I sat in a cafe in Rome and drank a cappuccino without a hint of guilt. I stood there, a silent witness to the total collapse of the family I had almost destroyed myself to save. The love I thought was there, however twisted, had never existed. It was a transactional alliance, and now that the currency of my suffering had run out, the transaction was over. The noise brought Mrs. Miller to her window next door. I saw her curtain twitch, her face a grim mask of vindication. I had asked her to listen, to be a witness if things turned violent. This was better than I could have written. After a minute of their snarling, weeping chaos, I spoke. My voice cut through the noise, quiet but absolute. Stop! They both froze, panting, hair disheveled, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and terror. I don't care whose idea it was, I said, picking up my briefcase and the court summons from the coffee table. The law will sort that out. You will both be served these papers formally within the week. I've instructed my lawyer that I am open to a plea deal, one that involves full financial restitution and a guilty plea to avoid the worst of the jail time. That's more mercy than you ever showed me. I turned and walked toward the front door. I had said everything I needed to say. Audrey, wait. My mother's voice was a broken plea. She stumbled off the bed, reaching for me. Please, we're family. You can't just leave us like this. What will people say? I paused at the threshold, the cold winter air rushing in. I didn't look back. Tell them the truth, I said. For once in your lives. Then I closed the door on my past. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal procedures, but for the first time in my adult life, the blur was on my terms. My attorney, a stern but compassionate man named Mr. Henderson, was a pit bull. The evidence was so overwhelming that the defense lawyer my mother and Whitney scraped together had little room to maneuver. To pay it, the bank is already initiating foreclosure proceedings. My lawsuit will ensure any remaining equity goes to repaying the debt you owe me. The reality of homelessness, of true financial ruin, finally penetrated the bubble of entitlement they had lived in for so long. My mother's knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the rented hospital bed, the plastic crinkling under her weight. She looked old, small, and defeated. Then, in a move that was both predictable and utterly devastating, she turned on Whitney. Her head snapped up, and she pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at her favorite child. It was her, she cried, her voice raw with a new, genuine desperation. Audrey, please, you have to believe me. I'm an old woman. I was confused. I was grieving. She pressured me. She said we'd lose the house. She said she needed the money for her social life. She said you'd never know. It was all Whitney's idea. From the very beginning, the betrayal was so swift, so venomous, that even I was momentarily stunned. Whitney's face went from pale to flushed with incandescent rage. You lying witch! Whitney screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She lunged at our mother, not with the weak flutters of a sick girl, but with the full force of a furious, healthy woman. She shoved her backward onto the bed. My idea? You were the one who said we could finally get the kitchen renovated. You were the one who wrote the scripts for every phone call. Cry more, Whitney, sound weaker. Tell her the pain is in your bones today. You coached me. You spent every dime just as fast as I did. They were like animals, tearing into each other amidst the ruins of their shared lie. The hospital bed shook as they grappled, screaming accusations, ripping apart the last shreds of their alliance. My mother clawed at Whitney's arm, hissing about ingratitude. Whitney shouted about a lifetime of being spoiled only to be thrown to the wolves. Fix this. I never responded. My lawyer handles all communication. They are, as far as I am concerned, strangers who share my DNA. The bond one thought was unbreakable was just a chain they fashioned. I have cut it and I feel no guilt. Only relief. 2 years later, epilogue. I am sitting on the balcony of my apartment, which is now filled with plants, books, and art I've collected from my travels. The sun is setting over the Chicago skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. On the small table beside me is a half-finished cup of herbal tea and a stack of design sketches. I've gone back to school part-time for graphic design. It's something I do for me, for the joy of it. My life is quiet, curated, and whole. The exhaustion that once felt permanent has been replaced by a steady, humming energy. I have friends, real friends who like me for my humor, my company, not my capacity to give. I even went on a few dates recently, something that would have been unthinkable before. I'm learning to trust cautiously. The other day, I received a formal letter from the probation office. The restitution payments, automatically deducted from their wages, are ahead of schedule. The financial chapter is nearing its close. Sometimes, in my quiet moments, I think about that promise I made at 16 by my father's casket. I thought being strong meant carrying everything, silently, until I broke. I was wrong. True strength isn't about how much weight you can shoulder for others. It's about having the courage to set down a burden that was never yours to carry. It's about looking at the people you love and saying, "Your choices are not my sentence." My father wanted to protect us. In a way, by finally protecting myself, I believe I've honored his true wish, for his daughters to be safe and happy. Whitney and my mother chose a path of deception. I chose a path of truth, however painful it was to uncover. The suitcase in the attic held the evidence of their crime. But in leaving it behind, I found the key to my own freedom. I am no longer Audrey the victim, the caregiver, the dutiful daughter. I am just Audrey, and that is finally, profoundly enough. This was The Suitcase Deception. Audrey's story is a powerful reminder that the deepest wounds often come from those closest to us, and that healing sometimes requires the courage to walk away. It asks a difficult question. Where do we draw the line between family duty and self-preservation? If her story resonated with you, or if you've ever faced a similar crossroads, share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the most noble promise you can keep is the one you make to yourself. Thank you for listening.